which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello and good evening. This is Don Swans, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the April 12th issue of the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. In the short history of world communism, North Korea has always stood apart. Stalin's Soviet Union is gone. Mao Zedong's China has liberalized and integrated itself into the global economy, but not North Korea. In the 8 decades following World War II, the country carved a unique path among the nations of the former Soviet bloc as the one country that has endured, largely in the same mold in which it was first fashioned under state founder Kim Il-sung II. Today, the North Korean stranger today, North Korea is stronger than ever. In self-imposed isolation, it has fortified its nuclear deterrent and vastly expanded its arsenal of intercontinental ballistic missiles, capable of striking the U.S. mainland, making it virtually impervious to an external strike. Even as its longtime friend, Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba are pushed to the brink by President Trump. How did that happen? Pyongyang's ruling Kim dynasty defied Soviet efforts to curb idolization of leaders and deftly navigated a vicious fight between its patrons in Moscow and Beijing, emerging as a lone, grim success story among the former socialist allies. Unlike China and Vietnam, it hasn't openly adopted key elements of the Western-led economic order that it once spurned. Unlike Cuba, it has become a major threat, one of the West's most consistently confounding geopolitical adversaries. Most crucially, Kim Il-sung built up an extraordinary cult of personality around himself that was durable enough to hand down to his son and then his grandson, the current leader, Kim Jong-un. Now, with Kim Jong-un's daughter ever present at his side, the dynasty is positioned to stretch well beyond its 8 decades. Although North Korea has relentlessly suppressed religion and vilified American missionaries, the origins of this hereditary cult are found in a surprising place: Protestant Christianity, and in particular, postbellum American Presbyterianism. An unexpected invitation in the fall of 1991, the American evangelist Billy Graham received one from Pyongyang. "It will be a great joy to welcome you to our church," read the letter, sent by leaders of North Korea's state-sanctioned Protestant and Catholic churches. As much as any one person could be said to embody 20th century American Christianity. Graham, America's pastor, was it. Then 73. He had preached the gospel before an estimated 215 million people in crusades that spanned from New York's Madison Square Garden to Moscow's Bolshoi Theater. Graham was accustomed to preaching in peculiar settings, including several trips he made behind the Iron Curtain at the height of the Cold War. Even so, the invitation from Pyongyang was unusual. Unlike East Germany, Poland, and the other communist bloc countries, North Korea had not shown any signs of buckling. Kim Il-sung had ruled without interruption for nearly half a century, while Nikita Khrushchev had systematically dismantled Stalin's cult of personality in the 1950s, and Deng Xiaoping had curbed the excesses of Mao worship in the late 1970s. In North Korea, Kim Il-sung's power seemed only to grow with time. In portraits, in homes and classrooms, in photographs on the front page of the country's main party newspaper, on lapel badges pinned over citizens' hearts. Kim's images became synonymous with the state, and he was omnipresent in plaques at factories commemorating his visits, in hymns of praise sung by school children, and in the white cloths draped over subway seats where he had once been seated and where no one could ever sit again. Foreign visitors to North Korea were shocked to see the country's leader hailed as nothing less than a god. State media regularly applauded citizens who aimed earthquakes or floods, amid earthquakes or floods, laid down their lives to protect sacred images of Kim Il-sung. After floods swept one rural county, North Korea's state-controlled news agency recounted the exhumation of corpses from the silt. Found out in their bosoms were portraits wrapped with vinyl sheets to prevent them from being spoiled by water. The campaign to glorify him, wrote one biographer in 1988, has surpassed fanatic religious fervor. The North Korean sun of the nation shines both day and night, and it is hard to escape his ubiquity. To ensure complete devotion, North Korea spent decades stamping out rival faiths, most notably Protestant Christianity, killing pastors and thousands of lay believers. The mere possession of an unauthorized Bible could mean imprisonment. As North Korea's hagiographers rewrote history, they held American missionaries responsible for the country's misfortunes, while state-sponsored novels, plays, and museums depicted them as jackals who subjected Koreans to vile human experiments. Kim sought to portray himself as the true Messiah, displacing Christ as the benevolent Son of the world. People of the world, if you are looking for miracles, come to Korea. An official North Korean party newspaper declared in a Christmas 1980 editorial. Christians do not go to Jerusalem. Come rather to Korea. Do not believe in God. Believe in the great man. Even by the standards of the world's foremost itinerant minister, Reverend Graham was puzzled by the invitation. In Beijing, just 2 days before boarding his flight to Pyongyang, Graham told reporters that he still didn't understand the North Korean overture. The preacher pleaded ignorance, but Pyongyang was a familiar place for the Graham family. In the 1930s, his wife, Ruth Bell Graham, had attended high school there on a sprawling Presbyterian mission compound on Pyongyang's west side. Missionary kids like Ruth attended school there amid some of Northern Korea's earliest and most prestigious Western institutions. His first, missionary-run high school, college, and modern hospital, as well as a Presbyterian seminary, the world's largest. Then there were the churches, none greater than Pyongyang's Central Presbyterian Church, which was so packed each week with congregants that missionaries feared the walls would begin to bulge out. Wednesday evening prayer meetings could draw crowds of 1,400 people. The city of Pyongyang became so dominated by Christians that it acquired a nickname, the Jerusalem of the East. By the time the Reverend Graham boarded his plane in the spring of '92, the Jerusalem of the East was no more. The devastation of the Korean War and decades of Kim Il-sung's rule had systematically wiped out the churches and Christian schools, driving 300,000 Christian believers in the north into hiding, or across the 38th parallel to the U.S. back to south. That historic exodus helped turn South Korea into a stronghold of the Christian faith and one of the world's biggest exporters of missionaries. Meanwhile, Pyongyang became staunchly religious in its own way, with symbols and rituals that revolved around one man. Despite its peculiarities, it was immediately apparent to visitors like Reverend Graham that the ideology and imagery of the system Kim Il-sung had erected had much in common with Christianity. Shortly after arriving in Pyongyang, the American evangelist visited a humble thatched hut on the outskirts of Pyongyang, where Kim was said to have been born on April 15, 1912. The pastor and his delegation could only shake their heads at the similarities to the other faith that had once dominated the city. All they're missing are the manger and the 3 wise men, the preacher quipped. At the time of Reverend Graham's trip, the world had witnessed the fall of several socialist states, and so many observers it was only a matter of time before the anachronism in Pyongyang was swept into the dustbin of history. But unlike his peers, Kim Il-sung had built a personality cult, robust enough to be passed down to successive generations. While North Korea may have started out extolling Marxist-Leninist ideas, It later removed portraits of Marx and Lenin from Kim Il-sung's square in central Pyongyang. By the 1980s, Marx and Lenin were quoted by North Koreans primarily to blame the ideology as an incomplete theory, which failed to find a solution to world affairs, according to one former Korean socialist ally. Instead, Kim Il-sung supplemented and eventually replaced Marxism-Leninism with the Church's ideology, a philosophy that the great leader, as Kim Il-sung was known, is said to have begun developing as a 14-year-old revolutionary. Though Churches, sometimes spelled J-U-C-H-E, is typically described as an ideology of self-reliance, it was replete with quasi-religious overtones, so much so that one scholar had dubbed it the Gospel of Chuche. It wasn't enough for Kim Il-sung to have a revolutionary ideology of his own. As the great leader entered the twilight of his life, even more grandiose tributes were heaped on the man. He seems to have been called by every honorary title imaginable, noted one biographer. The country's leading novelist, philosopher, educator, designer, agricultural experimenter, architect, industrial management specialist, general manager, and ping pong trainer. After Kim's death in 1994, his son and successor, Kim Jong, made his father North Korea's eternal president, allowing him to rule in perpetuity over a country that had, in effect, become one with its founder. These developments, which looked so little like communism and so much like religion, appalled Kim Il-sung's former socialist backers, especially because it resembled a religion that had once held such a firm grip in northern Korea. Although Kim would later obscure and distort the impact of Christianity and what it had on his thinking, in hindsight, its imprint on his life is unmistakable. In America, Presbyterians preached salvation from sin through the grace of a merciful God, but they also taught a message of equality of all people before God, a radical idea when it was introduced to Korea in the late 19th century. These tenets were embraced with unusual fervor by Koreans in the country's northwest, especially in and around Pyongyang, where the future North Korean leader came of age in a Christian bubble. Kim Il-sung's upbringing gave the young man a front row seat to the power of faith, its power to mobilize and inspire awe, devotion, fear, or zeal. More than money, power, or fame, faith alone could speak to one's eternal fate. When Kim Il-sung was catapulted into power at the end of World War II, he began crafting a state that consciously or unconsciously drew on the ideological heritage of his family and that which they had received from Presbyterian missionaries. He demanded faith and even worship from his followers, creating a belief system that was redolent of the Christian teachings and practices that he had been raised with. Jimmy Carter, the former U.S. president and longtime Sunday school teacher, who traveled to Pyongyang in 1994 to meet Kim Il-sung, was struck by how much North Korea resembled the Branch Davidians, a Christian religious sect in Texas, whose standoff with U.S. federal agents had resulted in 86 deaths the year before. It's a society like the religious group at Waco, Carter wrote that month. Followers of Kim Il-sung's ism were called upon to study his works and memorize his aphorisms, to dust framed portraits that hung in the main room of every residence, and to bow in reverence before his statue on Kim's birthday, on New Year's Day, and on almost every other day of any significance, including one's graduation and wedding days. One North Korean who defected while studying in Poland in 1989 put it more succinctly. When I was in North Korea, I thought Kim Il-sung was God. Indeed, if Kim Il-sungism were classified as a religion, it would be called, or it would be, one of the world's largest, claiming roughly as many adherents as Judaism. For many North Koreans, it wasn't until they had left the country, in some cases on secret assignments on behalf of the great leader, that they first recognized the religiosity of the ideology they've been raised in. One North Korean commando captured during a daring 1968 mission to assassinate the South Korean president in Seoul recalls the confusion he felt when first encountering Christianity. When they talked about God, it kept reminding me of Kim Il-sung, recalled Kim Sin-jo, who later became a Christian pastor. Kim Hyun-hoi, a North Korean agent who helped blow up a South Korean jetliner in November 1987, before being arrested and eventually converting to Christianity, went further in drawing a line between Christianity and Kim Il-sungism. If you learn the Bible first and then learn church, you'll be able to understand it much easier, she said. I think you can even replace the name Jesus with the name Kim Il-sung. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Let's change direction. We'll still read from the Wall Street Journal Review, but this time we'll take a look at this article, The Queen Bee of MAGA Socialites. It's written by Eliza Collins. Let's take a look at what it's about. Jessica Reed Krause needed to clear her head. The U.S. had recently struck Iran, a coterie of Make America Healthy Again moms were fuming over new perceptions for companies making a pesticide ingredient, and some of the Epstein files about President Trump were missing. On top of that, Kraus' husband had decided that this weekend was the time to refinish their kitchen island. It was early March, and Mercury was in retrograde. So the conservative writer and influencer to the Maha crowd that she decided to calm herself by organizing photos. Sitting on the couch, wearing sunglasses, as the California sun streamed in, Kraus shuffled through her Polaroid photos taken while socializing with the most powerful people in the world. Billionaire Elon Musk, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles. Her favorite, a pair of pictures of President Trump, were still at the frame shop, she said. She decided to put them in her entryway, so they'd be the first things anyone coming into her house would see. Kraus' access to the Trump administration is not feigned. The former Democrat is in a group chat that includes former Attorney General Pam Bondi and Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard. Kraus describes it as a women's support group. She sat down with Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. during visits to Washington and has stayed at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport. She sat alongside a nuclear reactor during a flight with Energy Secretary Chris Wright. She still isn't quite sure she understands what a nuclear reactor is. She parties with the MAGA jet set inside their homes in Washington, D.C. and at Mar-a-Lago. While she personally prefers organic tequila, she says she knows a lot of people are stepping away from these parties to take drugs. Along the way, she chronicles it all like a gossip columnist for her 1.5 million Instagram followers and nearly 500,000 Substack subscribers under the name House Inhabit. She makes at least 7 figures for these political musings mixed with astrology. Trump is the most Gemini to ever exist, and aliens. She also does her own investigation of criminal cases, advocating for freedom for some of the most controversial felons in American history, including longtime Jeffrey Epstein associate Ghislaine Maxwell and Elizabeth Holmes, the Theranos founder convicted of running a year-long fraud scheme against investors. Kraus, who seems to be everywhere all at once, has found her role in the Trump era. Politics is a party, and I'm your invite to the VIP section. People want to know about healthy food and recipes and ways to improve their diet. And they also care about fashion. They want to know about parties at Mar-a-Lago and weddings and what these women act like behind the scenes. Kraus said in one of her several conversations with the Journal. Her critics, including a pointed social media account focused on her, argue her advocacy for people like Maxwell hurts victims and say she pushes unverified conspiracy theories. They say her alignment with the Maha movement and questioning vaccines is dangerous. Some former fans are horrified by the rightward turn. Eliza Orlins, a former public defender and Democratic influencer, Said Krauss is dangerous because she shares information to such a large following. She is hugely influential, Orland said. She is being unbelievably reckless. Krauss said, and her audience spans the entire ideological spectrum. I know I get labeled at this radical right-wing voice, but I have moderates, a lot of moderates, within my audience. Washington used to be a stodgier place where power followed clear-cut rules. Politicians, lobbyists, consultants, business executives, and journalists all keep their lanes. But since Trump's return to office, jobs have shape-shifted. Krauss is simultaneously an influencer and writer who is paid for her content, which includes coverage of the administration from a most favorable lens. Many of the same people she writes about, she also considers her friends. Mark Halperin, a longtime political journalist who has become popular with the MAGA crowd, said Krauss thinks about storytelling in terms of personalities rather than ideology. Krauss, with her stream of consciousness, writing and carefully curating visual layouts, has been able to give Republicans a glamour shot of the last year under Trump. Part of her popularity is for her audience of all ages, and obviously skews more female than male. It gives them their yearbook, he said about his friends. It gives them their version of Vogue, to see the beautiful faces and the clothes and the parties. After losing some Democratic followers of her mommy blog during COVID for skepticism over the vaccine, Krauss became a star with the medical freedom crowd. Then in 2022, she started covering the defamation trial of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, sharing salacious stories from her sources, including a call from Depp, and taking Depp's side. Her following exploded. During the 2024 campaign, she was connected with Kennedy, who was running a long-shot bid for the presidency. She started giving him favorable coverage and was given unrivaled access. Her coverage of him was also thrilling to her audience, many of whom were tapped into his Maha mission after spending decades being ostracized. At the same time, she was personally befriending people in Trump's orbit. She was also covering his campaign. After Kennedy decided to endorse Trump, she suggested Donald Trump Jr. and Kennedy go falcon hunting, which they did for a campaign event. Krauss and her son joined. Her transformation has been as rapid as it was unlikely. Half a decade ago, she was renting out her guest house to make ends meet. Krauss, who used to blog about vacations on a budget and home renovations, has become so busy that her husband quit his job as a construction worker to be a stay-at-home dad. It is now Mike who is making meals and ferrying the kids to school and the beach. On this particular Sunday, he was underneath the kitchen sink as Krauss spoke to the journal nearby. The Epstein files have been one of Krauss's most complicated storylines. She has at times been critical of the administration's handling of the files. It's just been one fumbling after another, she told the journal. They built it up. They built up this conspiracy. They did that, and then they couldn't deliver. The Justice Department has released millions of files related to Epstein, the financier convicted of sex trafficking charges before his death in prison, but has withheld many others. Trump's name appears in the Epstein files. The two socialized for years, though Trump said he cut ties with Epstein before his 2008 conviction. Being named in the files is not a sign of wrongdoing. Krauss was also one of the influencers who was given a binder of information from the Justice Department related to the Epstein files early last year. She was photographed leaving the White House in a hat that said Trump was right about everything. She said Trump offered a table full of merchandise during the visit, and she picked the hat because it was most iconic. White House aides privately refer to the binder event with the influencers as the original sin. The Wall Street Journal has reported. In November, she hosted a party in Washington, D.C., where she did a question and answer session with George Santos, the former congressman who was convicted of wire fraud and aggravated identity theft, and later had his sentence commuted by Trump. During the conversation, Krauss said to Santos that he was relatable because he was either loved or hated. She asked him about everything from his experience in prison to who the sexiest members of Congress were. Asked by the Journal what she thought of Santos' case after the party, she responded, "I hardly know anything about the Santos case," adding she had no problem promoting him without all the details. Between all the travel back and forth from D.C. to Florida, the interviews, the parties, Krauss stands to find enough time to keep up. She recently started staying up all night at least once a week to write in a Laguna Beach office tucked into an alley just steps away from the beach. Her office, like her home, is exactly styled by her and built by Mike. A pair of Trump-bedazzled cowboy boots sit on the chair. A swing dangles lazily in the middle of the room. On the side wall, jars of healthy Maha favorites such as dried fruit and nuts sit between the fridge of water and sodas and a collection of alcohol. Rouse, whose alignment with Kennedy and her Maha mom friend group certainly dabbles in their world, including attending a recent conspiracy theory party where they made tinfoil hats and drank crystal-infused wine. At the same time, she said she has her vices: Diet Coke, alcohol, and Bluetooth headphones. A no-no for some in the movement, given the exposure to electromagnetic radiation. I think there are fanatics in every circle here involved in politics. But yes, there's fanatics where they let the discussion of health just rule their every thought and concern, she said. I think extremists and the radicals are a little too much for me to handle. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review, April 12th issue, on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Turning to the books section, the lead article is entitled "Two Cheers for Liberal Democracy." It's written by Tunku Beradarjan. Actually, it's a book review of the Revolutionary Center, a Pegasus publication written by Adrian Woolridge. Beradarjan is certainly a very regular contributor to the journal. Let's see where this direction takes us. Liberalism has come to acquire a bewildering range of meanings over the years. Our understanding of the word is, by necessity, contextual. Winston Churchill, believe it or not, called himself a liberal, as did John Maynard Keynes. In its primordial form, liberalism was a political belief that the building block of society is the individual, an idea tethered loosely to the Christian notion that every single human being contains a divine spark. In the Revolutionary Center, Adrian Woolridge, its author, sums up the early liberal demand thus: "Do not judge me as a member of a group. Judge me as an individual with unique talents." Mr. Woolridge is a columnist at Bloomberg Opinion and was previously the political editor of The Economist. He was also a fellow at All Souls College in Oxford. By some measures, the pinnacle of British academic achievement is that work at Oxford. This, his 13th book, was written as a study of the lost genius of liberalism, a loss Mr. Woolridge laments fiercely. His aim, he tells us, is twofold: to recount the history of liberalism with a focus on the values that need to be reanimated, and to offer a liberal blueprint to address the problems that his creed confronts. He accomplishes the first task with panache and erudition. The second is performed less persuasively, in part because the world is now a coarse place, much less receptive to his civilized ideas. Mr. Woolridge gives us a bravura performance of summary and synthesis in his telling of the history and substance of liberalism. The original philosophy had four ingredients: freedom of thought, a free market, room for creative disagreement and diversity, and a removal of obstacles to self-development. From this combination, a meritocracy emerged, supplanting aristocracies in lands where feudalism had been weakened by progress. This meritocratic world, the author tells us, was begat by four revolutions: the industrial, the American, the French, which is really the least liberal of the four, and the open competition revolution that happened concurrently in Britain, with power transferred from a landed aristocracy to an aristocracy of talent. Of these, the impact of the American Revolution was most profound. The American Republic, Mr. Woolridge says, was and remains the greatest of all exercises in liberal constitution making. With a constitutionalism based on separated powers, ineradicable rights, and clearly prescribed elections with the peaceful handover of power from loser to winner. The most serious threat to liberalism was the eruption of Bolshevism, fascism, and Nazism between 1917 and 1945. Liberalism's dark shadow, Mr. Woolridge tells us, is populism. After the war, liberalism kept populism under control, restricting it to a freak show rather than the main event. Witness the political banishment in Britain of Enoch Powell, whose dire warnings in 1968 against unchecked immigration would likely receive a more sympathetic hearing today. In the U.S., Pat Buchanan never surpassed modest limits of political success. Yet a global populist revolution could not be kept at bay forever. And the financial crisis of 2008 and 9 laid bare the excesses of the Western liberal. Fast forward to today, when we find ourselves in the age of the strongman. The cause of the current crisis is Donald Trump, Mr. Woolridge writes, though he's not the only cause. The biggest economy outside the U.S. is run by Xi Jinping, a suffocating Marxist-Leninist autocrat. India, the world's most populous country, is in the hands of the illiberal Narendra Modi. Hungary's Viktor Orban has brought illiberal democracy within the borders of the European Union. To top them all, there's Vladimir Putin, who, Mr. Woolridge writes, stalks the world like Milton's Satan. Mr. Woolridge also calls out the enemies of liberalism embedded within liberalism itself. The progressive left is as illiberal as the Trumpian right, perhaps more so, when it comes to currents turn with the tides of finance and immigration. Matthew and Rochelle Brentler are members of London's upper middle class. Matthew works in the finance industry. Rochelle is the daughter of Hugo Grin, a Holocaust survivor, rabbi, and BBC regular. A punk in her youth, Rochelle later wrote for the Financial Times. Zach, the second of the couple's two boys, was schooled at Mill Hill, not Westminster or Harrow, though still one of the city's better private schools. The deregulation of London's financial markets and the post-1990s wave of globalization had flooded the city with foreign money. The Thames waterfront, Mr. Keefe writes, became a sanitized playground for tourists and young professionals. Russians, Arab, Indian, African, and Chinese investors turned London's property market into a safe deposit box. The children of oligarchs from the former Soviet Union lived large in the nightclubs of Mayfair. In early 2019, Zach met Akbar Shemji, a Mayfair-based businessman. Suddenly, Zach, who bought a suit and canceling people it doesn't like progressives. And Trumpsters are driven by the same Manichaean politics. What's more, the transformation of liberals into a smug establishment has driven a wedge between the liberalism and ordinary people, the most lurid proof of which came in September 2016, when Hillary Clinton described Trump-adjacent blue-collar voters as deplorables. Mr. Woodbridge is at best in charting the excesses of left liberalism, one of three factions into which he says liberalism has splintered. The other being neoliberalism, the politics of markets, über all, as defined by Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, and practiced by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and managerial liberalism. The author's phase is to describe the politics of bien-pensant technocrats who run global and national institutions, including universities and non-governmental organizations. The left liberals are, as the virus within, more harmful to liberalism than the foot soldiers of MAGA. They are, Mr. Woolbridge writes, wedded to three adamant ideas. The first is a commitment to rights. Which appears decent enough until we realize their concept of rights has experienced Weimar-like inflation over the years. This is rendered even more troublesome by the disconnect to these new rights from duties and practical questions such as deliverability. The second left liberal obsession is a culture of repudiation. In the words of Roger Scruton, the author of How to Be a Conservative in 2014. A hostility to the Anglo-Saxon establishment, Mr. Woolridge writes, has meant traditional values are rejected wholesale and every intellectual discipline is deconstructed. The third pillar of the left liberal is the elevation of a group over the individual, which is an exasperating rejection of the original basis of liberalism. The politics of identity is swept over the body politic to the exclusion and alienation of the white working class. In this environment, the author tells us, oppressed groups can do no wrong. Heavily eroded, too, is the idea of meritocracy and open competition. An additional source of damage to liberalism is the conflict, open and undisguised, between conservative Islam and liberalism. Muslim fundamentalism, writes Mr. Woolridge, feeds on the West's perceived decadence. Why respect your host society's traditions when those traditions are routinely mocked by your host themselves? How should liberalism resuscitate itself? Mr. Woolridge's solutions range from the practical but politically incendiary to the cerebral but likely impracticable. End easy asylum, he says, and make sure that immigration always fulfills the welfare of host societies rather than the demands of sending societies. Liberal societies, the author states, need to put more emphasis on assimilating the people who are already here. It may alas be too late for that, especially in Britain, whereas Mr. Woolridge acknowledges entire sections of towns and are not just Muslim dominated, but Muslim only. And what to make of the plea that liberalism needs a great rebalancing? Woolridge spells it out. Dial back the elitism. Decentralize democracy. Rid liberalism of its recent taste for extremism. Make left liberals value excellence again. Make neoliberals get a conscience. And most intriguingly, make liberalism more pessimistic, less drunk on hope. The most pressing liberal task, Woolridge writes, is not to create a utopia. It is to prevent terrible things from happening. Prudence is in short supply, and it is the very scarce resource that requires us to block the roads to hell before building the stairways to heaven. Liberals of the world, unite, but curb your ambition. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the issue of the Wall Street Journal Review dated April 12th. We read from the Wall Street Journal Review every Thursday at 7 p.m. Narrator tonight has been Don Swans, and we thank you. We thank you very much for listening. Hope you're there, same place, on the dial of the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service next week at 7 p.m. Good night now.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have The New Yorker. At 9 o'clock, we have Money Magazine. At 10 o'clock, we have episode number 4 of Nash Falls by David Baldacci. Stay with us for these readings and more. If you or people you know shop at any of the Dash's super The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability